Hello everybody and welcome to a brand new Elder Scrolls Online video with me, Sherman. Today we're taking a look at some of the stuff that's coming with the new PTS, or not PTS, but the new Clockwork City DLC. We're going to take a look at one of the new armor sets, the Fortified Brass. I'm going to be showing off a build at the same time with it, and I'm kind of going to go over some of the reasons why I chose the skills I chose for this build, and go into a little bit more detail of skill placement with this and why. So this is a sorcerer tank build that I created over on PTS. Now I created it last PTS cycle actually, when it was US players, and then I recreated it here to show it off. So let's go ahead and take a look at it here, starting with the stats. As you can see, 30 points into stamina, 34 into health. You don't really need that, but it helps for the kind of setup that we're using. It helps a lot more to have that 28k stamina for this build. Now if you can get higher, that would be good, and you know, an Imperial would be a better option for a race with this build, but at the same time the Imperial doesn't have the same benefits the Orc does, and that's kind of why I went with Orc and I didn't go with Nord and I didn't go with Argonian, was because of the Orc's racial benefits apply a lot better to this build than the Nord or Imperial, even Argonian. So as you can see, 30k health, 16k magicka, 28k stamina. We are sitting at a 2k weapon damage with a 42% crit. The crit is there for your resolve, for your vigor, and for your few other abilities that you have to kind of increase their capabilities of critting. Not so much for damage. The weapon damage is there also for the same reason. Now this is on the main bar here, and when we switch to the back bar, you can see we get a little bit greater weapon damage, which is kind of nice, but our resistances don't change, and that's where you want to have it. You don't want these to change too much, because if they change too much, you're going to go over the resistance cap. In fact, this one goes over the resistance cap by just a small amount, 270 points, and this one is actually under the resistance cap by like 500 points. So I'll show you that buffed up here in a minute, and we can take a look. So we get major savagery from 2-throw, because we are using 5 pieces of 2-throw with 5 pieces of the fortified brass. We'll get to that here in a second as well. We have bound armaments, which is a Sorc ability that gives you extra stamina, and on top of that it increases your light and heavy attacks or your heavy attack damage by 11%. On a tank, heavy attack is like their main bread and butter for damage, so it's kind of a nice thing there. Moving on down here, bound armaments also gives you minor resolve, which increases your physical resistance, which on this build, because you're up front and personal with most content, you're going to be taking a lot more physical damage up front. So having that little bit of extra physical resistance is going to be better for you when it comes to taking damage. Spell damage, not so much, but that's okay. We've got a fix for that as well. Moving on down here, we have tri-stat food that the PTS offers us. If I was using live tri-stat food, I would actually be at 31k health and 29k stamina with a 17k magicka, because on the live servers we could actually get a little bit more in those resources for the tri-stat food. Here we don't get as much. So let's go ahead and take a look at our gear. And as I said, I'm wearing 5 2-throw. As you can see, everything in this build is golded out too. 2-throw is a really good set for not only for tanking in PvE, but also in PvP, because it does give you that minor or major savagery, and you don't have to have the Fighter's Guild ability on your bar. You don't have to drink a potion. You just have it. And with being a Sorc, you already are going to be using an ability called Crit Surge for the healing that it can apply to you, along with Vigor. So you have 2 tick heals. You have a tick heal, and then you have a heal that's coming off of damage. So it's kind of a nice combination of the two to keep your survivability up. And 2-throw with that higher crit chance allows those heals to hit for a little bit more, which is really good. And the increased weapon damage from this, even though it's so small, it kind of applies to that as well. The higher crit chance that the gear gives you is also a benefit, because the higher the crit, the more your vigor is going to crit, the more your Crit Surge is going to crit heal, and it's going to keep your survivability up really well. So, really good set. Now, Fortified Brass is one of the new gear sets that's craftable in the new content, in the new DLC coming out, and it gives you the perfect amount of resources, or survivability and resistances, and everything, that just makes you just right there at cap. So, I'm using 2 pieces, or 4 pieces sturdy here, with the 3 pieces infused, and a Nirnhone shield on both bars. And the reason I went Nirnhone on both bars is because it gives you the higher resistance values than reinforced with this kind of gear. So you want the Nirnhone shields here. And the new thing also with the trait changes will allow us to change these shields over to that. And as you can see, I'm running Master on one bar and Maelstrom on the other. Now the reason I'm running these 2 sets together is because of their benefits. This one, whenever you deal damage with puncture, you heal for a certain amount of health, and it also gives you a certain amount of spell and physical resistance equal to the amount healed. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be like, but why do you need those extra resistances when you're going to have Crit Surge or your Hurricane up all the time? You don't always have Hurricane up all the time, and because of that, you do need that extra resistance value just to kind of cover that. Now, you're not going to be taunting 100% of the time either, so it's kind of the trade-off here. When Hurricane falls off, you want to have Puncture up, so you do have those extra resistances. Now, it only lasts for 3 seconds, so it gives you a good amount of time to taunt, throw on Hurricane. Taunt, throw on Hurricane, kind of thing. On the sword here, I am using a Master Sword that's infused. As you can see, I do have a Crusher enchant. I messed around with a lot of different enchants for this build, for the weapons, and one of the things I found was Crusher's nice, it's good, but it's not as beneficial as using something like Hardening in an infused slot. Hardening actually would give me a 6k shield if it was up here and not down here, and it's kind of a huge difference, because that's going to give me a damage shield, which is going to help me mitigate damage, and I'm going to be able to apply that every 5 seconds, which is much better than applying Crushing in some cases. Now, not all, but if you're going for a greater survivable tank, having mitigation versus a debuff applied to your enemies is a good thing. So I could have went with an infused sword over here and had the shield on it and had a Crushing enchant here. That's good, but because of the way the build's designed, you do want this here, because this is where you're going to be you're going to be over on this bar only to apply damage, maybe a taunt or 2. It just depends on you're going to be on this bar the most. So having the damage shield on this bar is actually going to be more beneficial, and I'll get to that in a minute. I'm running 3 pieces of Toothrow Jewelry. Both these 2 pieces have weapon damage, and this one actually has Shield Play enchantment, which reduces the cost of bash and block by a certain amount, which does save you a lot of resources, but at the same time, having just that one thing of reduced cost actually plays really well into the way this is set up. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for the gear and everything. I mean, you could go with other things on here if you wanted to, but because the build uses certain abilities to apply benefits to your allies, having these 2 weapon damage is kind of beneficial, and it's kind of important to have it, because it not only does it play here, but it also plays with off something in your champion points. It plays off of something with some of your passives, or not your some of your passive things and some of your active things. So it's kind of a mixed bag. If you want to have something other than weapon damage here, you can do that. The shield play is a definitive. You have to have this on this build. These 2 are kind of optional, but I would have to say that it's preferred because of what it does for the build. Moving on, like I said, the Crusher enchant, not necessarily a preferred, but it's something that you can use. But I would suggest either changing this one if you're going to use this infused, and the Crusher enchant, maybe changing this to an infused as well instead of Nirnhone. But you are going to lose a lot of weapon damage on the back bar, and you kind of don't want to, because there's a reason why you have the Nirnhone one on the back bar. We'll get to that in a second. So I'm going to go over a few things with the skills, guys, and I'm going to cover every passive that you want unlocked, and then also every skill extra on top of that you want to unlock, because you don't want to use just one or have one specific set of skills with this build. You want to have a set of skills for like dungeon play and then one for trial play, and I'll get to that here real quick. So going over the skills, you want all class passives no matter what, always unlocked. And the reason why is because you never know if might want to use one of the abilities in the tree above it. And so having them unlocked allows you to have those benefits there just in case you do unlock those skills. So like I said, all passives in your class, no matter what. Moving on down here, the one-handed sword and shield, all passives. And then on the skills, you can unlock them all. And they're all going to be beneficial to you based on different things. And if you wanted to, you could even unlock the ultimate for this because of the free block, or basically the free ability to block without holding block is kind of nice. But you can still be knocked down, you can still be knocked back, you can still have certain things happen to you because this only does the blocking of the damage. It doesn't do the blocking of the abilities. So you still have to block certain things with it. On the main bar here, you can see though, I do have Pierce Armor from the Sword and Board, and I have Shield Assault. Now, I'm using Shielded Assault for a gap closer, mainly because when you're tanking in a dungeon, getting to certain enemies is going to be hard with playing a Sorc. So you don't have a pull to pull them to you. So getting to them is going to be the other option. You're either going to pull them to you or you're going to get to them. This is going to allow you to get to them, and it's also going to give you a decent damage shield, which is really good. Because of that 4K damage shield, it means you're going to absorb 4K worth of damage before they get to you, and that's going to be more beneficial to you in the long run. So on with the passives. So no more passives in here, in the weapon tree. In the armor tree, go ahead and fill out the light armor passives, these 3 top ones, just in case you decide you don't want to go with two throw, you want to go with something else. You can do that. And if you're not going to be using these two, the Master and Maelstrom set, you can go with Crafted also. Like, I want to go with a light, I want to have one light piece in here, and I'm going to go with this, this set, like two throw and the Sword and Board instead, and go with a monster set. And then you can craft into this stuff. You can craft into the light armor. Medium armor, you definitely want the dexterity and Windwalker. Don't worry about these other ones except for athletics. And the reason you want to unlock athletics, it increases your movement speed bonus of sprint, and for each piece of medium armor equipped, it also reduces your dodge roll costs for each piece of medium armor equipped. So this gives you a little bit of resource management when it comes to sprinting and dodge rolling, without having to waste champion points. Moving on into heavy armor, all passives maxed out. I do have all the soul magic passives, these two at least, filled out, and that's because this one allows you to revive without using a soul gem every hour, which is really nice. Especially it saves you soul gems basically. This one I keep unlocked basically for the purpose if I have any empty soul gems, I can get them filled pretty quick. 10% chance, you'd be surprised how often that happens. It's pretty much all the time. Moving on to the guilds. Fighter guild, fill out everything. Every one of these passes, because you want this one because it reduces the stamina cost of your fighter's guild abilities by 15%. And right now we're only using one, which is the Undaunted, so it's not affected by that. Or Dawnbreaker, it's not affected by that. Slayer you definitely want because you want that increased weapon damage from any fighter's guild ability slotted. Now, the reason I have Ring of Preservation unlocked is because I do swap this out with Stalwart Guard. Stalwart Guard is more of a thing for a trial use, and Ring of Preservation is more for dungeon use. And the reason I say that is because in a trial, you're going to be blocking a lot more. You're not going to be standing there doing a lot of damage. So applying this to one of your allies is a really good benefit, especially with the ability you're going to be using on the back bar. But do not remove Flawless Dawnbreaker. It's a big reason why this is here. It's not for the damage of the ability, it's for the weapon damage itself. So moving on, Banish the Wicked. This is a definite, even if you're playing a Magicka player, it doesn't matter. If you're playing anything, getting this benefit maxed out is super beneficial in dungeons and trials. Especially dungeons themselves, because you do fight a lot of Daedra, undead, and werewolves. So Daedra and Undead mostly, but you do get that ultimate gen really fast in dungeons. So having this maxed out is super beneficial. A skilled tracker you don't really need, but your fighter guild abilities deal an additional 20% more damage to Undead, Daedra, and Werewolves. So when you are in a trial or a dungeon that has a lot of Daedra or Undead, you can use Dawnbreaker and get that extra 20% damage, which is really good. Down here we have Bounty Hunter. Just because I do a lot of Fighters Guild stuff in Cyrodiil when I do play in that content, so this is kind of thing. But these ones up here are all definite ones you want unlocked. Moving on to the Mages Guild, I only have Persuasive Will. Thieves Guild don't have anything. Undaunted, I have Inner Rage unlocked, and then I have the Undaunted passives. As you can see, I only get a 4% thing for Undaunted because I'm wearing 2 medium and 5 heavy. So I kind of gave up that one piece, which 2% really isn't going to make a huge difference in the build's attributes by a massive degree. It would give me some beneficial stuff, but at the same time, this setup works really well the way it does. Moving on into the assault skills, we do have Aggressive Warhorn unlocked, and we do have Resolving Vigor. Aggressive Warhorn, you won't be using that much, to be honest, when you're playing this build, because you're using this a majority of the time, which this gives you and one other person critical strike damage, which in dungeons is great. In trials, not so great, because Warhorn's going to be more effective, and that's where things in this build is going to change, is you are going to swap abilities around a little bit. And I was wrong. This is for dungeon use. The other one's for trial use, the Ring of Preservation. The reason the Ring of Preservation from the Fighters Guild is going to be used in trials is because of the reduced cost in dodge rolling by 20%. And remember, you get an 8% already. That's 28% reduced cost in dodge rolling. That allows you to move and avoid certain attacks without having to block. You can dodge roll instead to avoid the major hits and stuff like that. It also reduces the damage you take while standing in the circle by 8%, and it increases your stamina recovery by 10%. But it doesn't just affect you, it affects anyone standing in the circle. So it makes it a more beneficial thing to have in a trial setting, and not so much in a dungeon setting. Because a dungeon setting, you're not worried about, 12 people, you're worried about 4 people, so having the ring in the dungeon isn't as necessary as it is in a trial. Sorry, I got those two mixed up. Moving back on down here, the reason why we're going to be switching out abilities for Aggressive Warhorn in a trial is because Aggressive Warhorn applies to multiple enemies or allies, max health, max stamina, max magicka, and it also gives them by 10%, but it also grants them major force, not minor force, for 9.5 seconds. And so you're going to be swapping out one of your ultimates for this later on. The next ability, of course, on our bar is going to be Resolving Vigor. Right here you can see. Resolving Vigor is a very powerful heal, especially in PvE content. It's a lot more powerful than it can be even in versus PvP. And that's because you don't get anything negatively applied against it in PvE for the most part. There are some bosses that do use like Major Defile on you or Minor Defile, but it's few and far between. So this allows you to keep your group sustained for a little bit. If you need to, if the healer goes down, you can cover it, that kind of thing. And then there's another ability that we're going to get to here in a minute. Also on the main bar, we do have Bound Armaments, like I said. This gives you physical resistance, increases your physical resistance by 1320. It also gives you that max stamina by 8%, and then it increases your damage done by 11% on heavy attacks. Being a tank, like I said, you use a lot of heavy attacks. Right, and of course, Flawless Dawnbreaker. So with the support skills here, I have 3 support skills unlocked. Reviving Barrier, this is your bread and butter for dungeon play. Because it's such a low-cost ultimate versus Warhorn, you can effectively keep this up more effectively in a dungeon. And in a dungeon, you're not worried about, like, oh, I gotta pop Warhorn every 5 seconds. You can actually keep this up every so often, and it stays for a very long time, especially if your allies aren't taking damage. And even if they do or have taken damage and you apply this shield, it'll heal them over 30 seconds. So it's a nice way to kind of keep people in play without the loss of them in a dungeon setting. So it's kind of that more beneficial thing. To me, in my opinion, this is actually better than Warhorn, in a lot of respects, especially if you're playing through dungeons and you want to play more defensively instead of offensively. You can really keep the group alive a lot better using barrier as a tank, because you're up front and you can just cast it out, and it, 12 meters is a pretty big range. So efficient purge for trials, you can switch this, put this on your bar, but you're going to put it on your back bar, or you can either put it on your back bar or your front bar. If you put it on your front bar, just change out shielded assault for efficient purge for trial situations, so that way you have that way of cleansing and removing stuff, and it's a lot lower cost in Magicka than some of your other abilities, or equal to some of your other abilities. So it's kind of that trade-off, hey, I'm going to go for this instead of this. Next up is Stalwart Guard. This one I unlocked for the purpose of when you're bonded to an ally, 30% of the damage they take is instead redistributed to you. This is why Barrier works so well with this, is because Barrier will absorb that 30% of the damage they take. So your shield will shrink faster, which is fine, but it also means that you mitigate more damage with the shield up and this applied. So it's kind of that trade-off. On top of that, you and your ally both gain critical strike damage by 10%. That critical strike damage also applies to heals from Vigor and from Reviving Barrier. So it can boost those crit heals by 10%, which is really nice. The bond will remain between you two, even at a 15-meter distance. So you can apply this to one of your Magicka DPS, you can apply it to one of your, your Stamina DPS, or you can even apply it to your healers, so that way their heals crit heal as well. So it's a nice trade-off skill to have on your bar, no matter what. Moving on to racials, of course, all racial passes, and the reason I said the Orc was the better option from this was because, one, they get brawny, and as you can see, this increases their max health and stamina by 6%. Then they get this, which increases their healing received by 5%, and their their health recovery by 20%. The health recovery is not so much of a big deal, but the healing received is a big deal, because that 5% plays onto the fact that you're wearing heavy armor, and one of the heavy armor passives gives you 8% healing received. This 5% takes you up to 13% healing received, which is going to be a greater benefit to you when it comes to the fact that you're a Sorc. So those healing received is going to be greater benefit. Also down here, you have the Swift Warrior, which increases your damage done with melee attacks by 4%. So all melee attacks you do, no matter what, are going to be boosted by 4%. I know it seems small, but it actually comes out to being a lot more than it looks when you're using a sword and board, especially, because with the sword and board you get 5% more weapon damage, and that 4% damage really plays on that 5% you get from using sword and board, and also the 8% you're having for having Undaunted, the Fighter's Guild ability on your bar, the Flawless Dawnbreaker. All that stuff kind of stacks together, but that 4% damage doesn't stack with that. It just increases your damage capability with things like Pierce Armor, and then of course on the back bar here we have Deep Slash, which gets boosted by another 4%. So it's kind of a nice benefit to boost those things' abilities and their damage, but also it just kind of helps, and it's kind of hard to explain. You'd have to see it. On the passives, on the crafting, alchemy, you definitely want medicinal use to increase the potion, your potion length by 30%. I use a tri-stat potion, so it can give me all 3 resources, and it gives me the recovery for all 3. So it increases the recovery of all 3 by 20%. So I get a really good recovery rate on top of that, them lasting 30% longer. The other one you want to make sure you have maxed out here is Gourmand, and of course Connoisseur. This increases your food and your drink time frames by 20 minutes, so you don't have to use them as often. So it's kind of a nice benefit. So let's go ahead and go back over. We're going to go over the skills real quick. Pierce Armor, main skill on the front bar, because this is going to be the one you're going to be using a lot of, because you want to get that major fracture, major breach applied to your enemies. So that way you get the 12 seconds, of reduction from that. Also, you're going to be taunting the enemy, and it does a decent amount of damage. Next up is Shielded Assault. Like I said, you can change this out for the Cleanse ability in the Alliance War. If it Purge ability, you can switch it out for that when you're in a trial. And in Dungeon, you don't really need it, so this actually works out better. Next up is Stalwart Guard. Really effective ability here, and that's because of the benefit, especially in a dungeon situation. Like I said, you, the tank, getting that 10% extra damage, really good, because it doesn't apply just to your heals, it applies to your damage as well. And as long as you're connected to that ally, it's up the whole time. So you get that 10% all the time, and that's really nice. Next up, of course, is Resolving Vigor. Really good heal. For you, a really good heal for your allies, and it's it's just a nice tick heal to have available. Of course, Bound Armaments, increased physical resistance by 1320, and then on top of that, the max stamina and the heavy attack damage. Really, really powerful. Moving on to the Flawless Dawnbreaker. Main reason for this, increased weapon damage while slotted. Now, the damage it does is kind of nice, but you have to really be buffed pretty good to get the most benefit out of it. Moving on to the back bar, we have Deep Slash. Now, a lot of people like to use Heroic Slash for the ultimate gen, but because we're a Sorc, we actually get a reduced cost in ultimate, and this actually hits multiple targets, and it applies minor maim to multiple targets. Remember, we're not a DK who can throw out talons, which actually is good but bad at the same time, and I'll explain that in another video. But it does apply the minor maim for 12 seconds, and it hits 3 targets. So you can actually apply minor maim to 3 targets, which is more beneficial than applying it to a single target, even though this skill is designed when you go heroic for single play. Trying to hit many targets with it kind of sucks. This one, you just flash out, hit 3. It does a little bit of damage to those 3. Does a decent amount of damage to one, a little bit of damage to the other 2, and it also puts the debuff on them for movement speed reduction by 60%. Next up, we have Inner Rage. This is your ranged taunt. In dungeon settings, you do need, it's nice to have a way to reach your enemies. So you don't really need this here if you don't want it in a dungeon. In a trial, definitely have this on your bar, because the greater range you have to taunt enemies means that you can grab enemies at a distance, get them off your allies, bring them to you, that kind of thing. But in a dungeon setting, they're too compacted to really require it, unless you're doing, like, say, Vaults of Madness when you're fighting the final boss and all the ads spawn on the outside. You can reach them with that, but it's really up to the player on that part. Next up, we have Crit Surge. This is an amazing ability. One, it boosts your weapon damage by 20% for 33 seconds, which is the longest buff for weapon damage almost in the game. On top of that, while active, your critical strikes heal you for 3,300 health. This effect can occur once every second. So every second you can be getting extra health. Now remember, we are using the Master Sword and board. And if you look at it, anytime you taunt, you heal. So every time you use that ability, you're going to heal. If it crits, you're going to heal twice. So it's kind of like, oh, I get 2 heals. This one here, Maelstrom weapon, anytime you deal damage with low slash, your next heavy attack, within 5 seconds gives you magic and stamina back. On top of that, if it hits and it crits, it's going to heal you. So it's not only going to give you that health or the magic and stamina, it's also going to have a chance of healing you. Your Hurricane ticks, which we're going to get to right now. Your Hurricane ticks every second. For every second that it takes damage, if it crits any time of those, you get healed. So it's a kind of a nice way to mitigate a lot of damage without having damage shields to block the damage. Like a DK has the ability to apply damage shields to his allies. This, you don't with this. So having that there is a very beneficial thing. So Hurricane is your major reward, major resolve. It increases your physical and spell resistance by 5,280. And it increases your movement speed by 10%. So it allows you to move around a little bit better and grab mobs at that increased movement speed, which is nice. On top of that, your bound armaments, like I said, the combination of this and some of your other stuff is it's just a nice combination. You also get the physical damage from this every 1 second for 15 seconds, and then on top of that, the winds grow in strength by up to 150% more damage, and up to 9 meters in size. So it starts at 5 and it goes all the way out to 9 meters. It reaches a large area, so when it comes to like ads and stuff that get spawned in, you can just move over to them a little bit, let this tick a couple times on them, and you'll grab their attention unless the DPS goes running over to fight them. So you can use that to pull aggro in close proximity, But at range, you can use your range time. The game does have a damage aggro mechanic, by the way. Bound armaments again, and then of course this is reviving barrier. Now the reason I use this for dungeon play and not trial play, even though it would work really good in trial play, is in trials it's all about doing damage, and that's it. It's all about getting the most damage done out of your group. So using Warhorn is more effective there, even though I think barrier is still the superior one to that for this particular build, because you don't have any way of applying damage shields to your allies. This gives you a way to apply damage shields to your allies. It's a much lower cost than it is on any of the other classes, besides maybe the Templar. But it also does the damage shield, applies it to your allies, and then it heals them over 30 seconds. And the heal it applies isn't going to be a massive heal, but if you pop this and then pop Vigor right afterwards on your allies, that's going to give them extra healing coming in while they have the damage shield active. And if the boss isn't focused on them, but they've taken a lot of damage because of like a major attack or something, the healer doesn't have to use a lot of heavy resources to heal those people. They can just apply some minor heals, like like an AoE heal or something, to bring them up to health, because that barrier's on them. It's kind of a trade-off there. Do I want to use a lot of resources to burst heal them, or do I want to use a lot of resources, or do I want to use resources to heal them over time because they have this 30k damage shield? Now the nice thing about barrier, as you can see, I get a 31,000 point damage shield with a 21k heal. Now, remember when I told you guys earlier it's essential to have the high weapon damage with this build? If you look at my Vigor, it only does 10k. So if I buff up my stuff here, and I go in and I take a look now, this barrier does 34,000 damage, absorbs 34,000 damage, and heals for 23 because I boosted my weapon damage. Now if I go over here and I look at this, my Vigor now hits for 10,878, and then the heal over time, to the allies is 8,393 or 94, and that's the best I can get with the build. But you got to remember, this can crit heal, and so can the barrier, because I do have a high crit chance. I have a 42% stamina crit chance, and this goes off of either Magicka or stamina, so it doesn't matter. The heal over time is going to be based off of either or. So if my Magicka stamina is higher, it's going to heal off of my crit heal from my stuff there, or it's going to be off the other thing. And that's kind of the reason why I went with this on my character, is to give me that force. Now you could switch this out, the Flawless Dawnbreaker, out for Warhorn, but at the same time, getting rid of this on this bar, because if you look here at the weapon damage, that's 2,041. When you switch, it's 2,176. When you buff up, it's 2,591 with 2,403. So it's literally only like 100, almost 200 points of difference. Not even, between the two. And so having the higher weapon damage on the front bar is super important for Vigor, because you want that higher weapon damage. You want that higher, crit chance, so that way you get those things applied. Okay, moving on to the champion points, and we're going to cover the champion points really fast. As you can see, I just got done respecking the champion points before I started the video. I had them set up one way, tested it a little bit, didn't like it, and then I went back to the original way I had it before. So, starting with the red cherry, we have 37 in the ironclad. This gives us a damage reduction of 15%. Now, you know that ringer preservation I told you about that gives you an 8% increase in damage reduction? It also applies to this. So instead of 15%, it's going to go to 23%. And the same thing over here. This is going to go to 23% damage reduction, along with these ones. These just go up to 18. Otherwise, you're going to get 18 here, and this is going to go to be 15, and it's going to be applying to that 18. So it doesn't matter. Either way, you're still getting the same benefit out of it, and it's really nice, because you only get the benefit of damage reduction stacks. So this 15% go into this, and that's 30 or 25. With 18, takes it up to 33% damage reduction. So that's why these ones are like that, 37, 37, and then 43, 43. Over here we have 14 into Expert Defender. This gives us damage reduction on our light and heavy attacks received by 9%, but they're considered direct damage, so that 9% gets stacked with that 15%, which takes us to 24%. And then on top of that, we get another 8% on top of it, plus another 10%. So we're actually going over 40% damage mitigation from light and heavy attacks, which is really good in PvE. Moving on, we have 56 in the Bastion. Now, if you guys notice, I didn't put anything in quick recovery, anything in the heavy armor focus. And the reason why is I went with the quick recovery is to increase the base amount of the damage shield from Reviving Barrier by 20%. That 20% increase is huge for Reviving Barrier. For some of the other damage shields I'm using, and that's why I said if you use the Infused Sword on the back bar, you want to put that there. But Nirnhond is better because it gives you that higher weapon damage. So when you do apply that barrier, it's a much bigger barrier. So really, really good option there. And that 20% really plays on it. Moving on to this bar, we have 23 into Warlord, reducing our break free costs. Remember, this game's all about resource management. In a lot of ways, you have to manage your resources. So having the reduced cost in certain things is more beneficial than not. We already get a 6% reduced cost on sprinting. We don't sprint a lot, so we don't need any more, to be honest. So that 6% we get from the 2 pieces of medium armor plays into this. We do have 10% reduced cost in Bash. This is 10%. Remember, we also get that 200 and something extra points in reduced cost in Bash from the shield enchantment we have on our jewelry. Moving on, we have 64 in the Mooncalf. This gives us a 13% stamina recovery. I went with stamina recovery on this build because I am a Stam tank. And if you look at my stamina recovery over here, it's really kind of low. But when I put down that ring, if I'm using Ring of Preservation, I get another 10% increase in stamina recovery. I'm a Sorc, I get 10% stamina recovery. I'm also an Orc. I don't get any stamina recovery. I don't need a high stamina recovery, but it does help when it comes to my light and heavy attacks. My heavy attacks in my return. So going back into here, we also have 70 or 64 into Tenacity. This increases our light and heavy attack return by 13%. So when we do a heavy attack, not only do we get the 25% from heavy armor and the 30% base, which is 55%, we now go to a 68% in return, which gives us a greater resource return in the long run. Almost equivalent to that of somebody using a Resto Staff with, that passive, and then, of course, the other passive on top of it. So you get a lot of more resources back with this. Moving on, we have 7 into Befoul, and that's because on one bar, sometimes we switch out one ability, and that's the taunt, the range taunt, for certain specific, very specific dungeon use with Reverberating Bash. Getting that extra 7% in there of reduced healing really plays well with it because, like Dire Frost Keep, the Witch at the end, using the Reverberating Bash reduces her healing received by a huge amount. And in fact, when she starts to heal with some of the life siphoning ability she uses, it doesn't suck as much life out of the ally because she's reduced by 32% or something. Next up, 56 in the Shadow Ward. As I said, I'm wearing 4 pieces of Sturdy. I have the block cost reduction thing, and then on top of that, I have 20% block cost here, which adds up to a lot more. And the fact that I'm using Sword and Board, where I get a 30% block cost reduction, or 36, that's 56 plus the 16%, and the extra 200 and something. I have a really low block cost. Moving on to the next part, we have 43 into Blessed and only into Blessed. We do not need Elfborn because we're not using any Magicka heals. All of our heals are coming from stamina. So we have 43 into here. Over here we have 35 into Physical Weapon Expert. This allows us to do increased light and heavy attack damage with our weapons, our sword and shield. And then we have 56 in Master Art, which also is boosted by our light and heavy attacks. So that's 20, 30, 40% right there. And then on top of that, we have 43 into Mighty, increasing our damage again by another 10%. So we have a 50% increase to our light and heavy attack damage. That's a lot better on a tank because most of the time you are only doing light and heavy attacks because you got to save your resources for other things like blocking, dodging, those kind of things. Next up, we have 23 into Precise Strikes. This increases our critical heals, from from the vigor and from the barrier by 10%. So it does give us that boosted healing from those. And on top of that, we get the extra critical heals from, or critical strikes from the other things. So we have a 20% actually. So it's kind of a nice trade-off. And then we have 7 into piercing, which gives us just a little bit more penetration on our attacks, which is kind of nice. And then I put 23 into shattering blows. Now, a lot of people are like, well, shattering blows is only a PvP orientated thing, and it's not. There is several bosses in the game that apply damage shields to themselves. Being able to mitigate those damage shields or remove those damage shields faster is going to be more beneficial for the tank to do because of that purpose. That is why I put 23 points into here to give me 10% increase in my damage done to enemies with damage shields. So if you guys haven't done Arx Cranium, the final boss, she uses damage shields. There's several world bosses, there's several other dungeon bosses that do apply damage shields. This is just a greater way to remove those damage shields faster. And that should be the tank's job anyways. A lot of other things too. When I use Reposit, as you can see, when I block a melee attack, I have a 15% chance to redirect damage back to the enemy, and it can occur every 5 seconds. So if I'm blocking certain attacks and stuff, I can do a lot of damage. But if I do this, and then I go back in here and I take a look at that Reposit, now it does 5,231 extra physical damage. So that's the other reason why I run so many points in here, is to get Reposit. I want that, and I also want Butcher. This increases my light and heavy attack damage by 5% to enemies below 25% health. Remember, I'm an orc. I get 4% extra damage to all melee attacks. That includes light and heavy. So that's actually 9% more damage I get. So that's the kind of the thing, the reason why the orc is such a better option here is because you get that greater benefit of the damage from light and heavy attack and all your abilities. So 28k freaking low slash. Now I don't have any of my add-ons turned on right now, and that's because I was getting too many errors when I had them open, like my combat matrix and things like that. I'm not really concerned about that when I'm looking at tank builds, so I don't have those on. But that was 28k damage, and that's pretty impressive, you know, for one attack to be 28k. But yeah, this build is really super tanky, even without anything like, you know, using any special abilities. As you can see, I get that small damage shield from the sword and board. And then on top of that, I can switch bars, I can taunt, I can apply vigor and have tick heals going on. But the vigor is really there for group support. The barrier is there for group support. Everything else on my character is about just pretty much trying to mitigate as much damage as possible, but also to help with to keep aggro, to keep their attention and everything. Me getting to the enemies faster when I have this up and using the charge ability like this allows me to get to the enemies and start applying damage before my allies do. And I can also keep the taunting up as well as a damage shield, because I can move between two enemies. And even though it costs me resources, I gain back so many resources from heavy attacks, I don't need to worry about it. I can literally spam like this. Like, I'm going to spam real quick just so you guys can see. You need to find... There's a little bugger over here usually. Doesn't look like he's here. But I will find me an enemy just so I can show you my heavy attack return. So there's a little snake. We'll go ahead and heavy attack it. And you can see I got a pretty decent chunk of my resources back when I did that heavy attack. And that's because of that 13% return, along with the other stuff I have. And the fact that my stamina, recovery rate, I can boost it up a little bit. So it's kind of just the benefits of having, oh, hey, guess what? I can do this versus I can do this. And then also with using the Maelstrom sword and board, if I do low slash, like let me go ahead and burn through some resources real quick. Like I said, okay, so heavy attack, decent amount. Low slash uses some resources, mass amount of resources back. And then if I just sit here and heavy attack, as you can see, I'm getting about 2 to 3k resources back from my heavy attacks, which is really, really good for a tank for maintaining their resources. And that's pretty much the build in a nutshell, guys. I would show you it on a boss, but honestly, I'd be there for about 20 minutes fighting the dang thing, so it's really... not even 20 minutes, it's like 15, but still, I don't want to spend 15 minutes fighting a boss with 2.8 million health, or 2.3 million, I think it is, something like that, when I can just show you on a few trash mobs. The nice thing, though, like I said about the build, is you do have all that AoE damage going on from Hurricane. You have Deep Slash, which allows you to apply that minor maim to multiple targets. You have a lot of flexibility with this build, and resource management isn't too hard, because you're not using a lot of magic abilities. You're literally only using... Oops, I do this every time. You're literally only using this... Oh my gosh, really? You're using this for stamina, you're using this one magic ability, and you're using a Magica Taunt. Unless you are on your main bar and you're using Purge. And then you are using a little bit of Magica. That's why the 16k really plays well with this build. And when you're in combat, that you have a low magic recovery, but you do have the Deep Slash thing with the sword and board on the back bar from the Maelstrom weapon. That gives you Magica back as well. So if I went over here and I just say... we'll just spit this dude down, get rid of some Magica, and I do this low slash and then I heavy attack, I'm going to get a 2k, stamina return on it, which is really good. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, the build's really self-explanatory. It's a really good tank build for dungeons and stuff. It's going to work really good in certain trials. Not all trials, like I don't know how well it would work in Halls of Fabrication because of all the AoE damage, but because of all the hits, the heals, and the fact that you have barrier and all that other stuff, it might be a little bit better. And the fact that you'll be using Purge. If you're using Warhorn, you're going to be taking a lot more damage, is all. So, really good build though. I mean, I've enjoyed it. When I tested it, I enjoyed playing it. I've enjoyed tinkering with it and messing around with it, making adjustments and everything. But with the gear set up this way, running that fortified brass with the 2-throw, and then on top of that running the master, set for the main bar and then Maelstrom for the back bar, just gives you good resource management, gives you good ways of keeping your health, your health up. It's a very self-sufficient, self-sustaining tank build, with not just resources, but also with healing and everything else. So it's just a really cool kind of tank build. Now, I would not suggest this as being the end-all be-all tank build, but it is definitely a good one. Fortified Brass, also do not try Fortified Brass, this gear setup, with a DK or a Templar, because they get a passive that boosts their spell and physical resistance. And on the Templar, you want that. You want that extra spell resistance. Sorry, not physical, just spell resistance. But it'd put you well over cap, so it'd be kind of pointless on the DK and the Templar to use this gear, unless you're wearing medium armor. And then it would be fine. But since I'm playing an Orc, and I'm doing a Sorc tank, I wanted that heavy armor benefits. Really works out really well. And I'm going to say this about Fortified Brass. Fortified Brass is definitely going to be a set that a lot of people might be using in PvP, because it basically gives you the resistance values of heavy armor. And if you're running that with, say, Shuffle in medium armor, that's going to give you a really good way to maintain, immunities from CC and all that kind of stuff. And on top of that, you're going to be able to run Shuffle with medium armor and have good resistances. So you might see a lot of people switching over to this gear set, possibly, depending on how well it works out, but I don't think a lot of people are going to want to give up certain other sets to benefit, or to fit this one in, is what I'm saying. So, but it is a really good set, and like I said, I was testing out this build. I wanted to see how the new gear worked, the Fortified Brass, with specific races. I tried different races with the build. I tried different classes with this gear set and everything. The only other one class that worked with this gear set really was Nightblade, and that's because they don't get any passive benefits towards resistances. And on a Nightblade, this set works really pretty good, because they don't get any extra beneficial, resistance values like the DK and the Templar do, or the Nord does from its winter embrace tree or whatever. But yeah, I like Fortified Brass. I think it's going to be a really cool set to mess around with. I can see some possibilities for like PvP, like I said, and PvE, where it'll fit in for certain builds, but not all builds. And this goes with all sets. Certain gear sets work with certain builds really good, and not so good with other builds, things like that. So it's knowing that we have more variety in gear also plays into it. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I know I'm kind of like behind on my videos, but that's okay. I got sick. I'm feeling a lot better today. So I have this video coming out today. I have another video going to come out tomorrow on another build, a Nightblade Healer build, and it's actually a really good Nightblade Healer build. Don't know how well it'll work in trials because I haven't had a chance to test it, just like I haven't had a chance to really thoroughly test this in trials yet. I have done some trial tinkering, and I can tell you this much, like when it comes to Maw, this build will work pretty good in Maw. It'll work really good in some of the older trials. Halls of Fabrication, not so sure. The new trial, I've gone in there in solo, and then I've gone in there in 2-manned, and I've gone in there in 3-manned to test the build to see how well it would work against some of the bosses and stuff like that. And it can take the hits. It just, some of the hits that you take, you have to avoid still, some of the damage. But other than that, you can pretty much just tank those bosses pretty easy. And that's if you're playing through that dungeon on normal, or you're playing it on vet without fighting all 3 bosses at one time. This build will work for that. But if you're fighting all 3 bosses at one time, this build wouldn't be the greatest option. So yeah, that's pretty much it though. If you guys like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you guys want to see more videos by me, hit the subscribe button. Other than that, I want to thank you all for watching. Until next time, have a wonderful day, and this guy will see you all later. Bye.